The topic we are going to discuss today is survey research. I am Raghav Reddy, professor in the Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad. So let us discuss the topics related to survey research: introduction, the epistemological basis of survey research, the methodological importance of numbers, definition and meaning, purposes of survey research, advantages and limitations, history of surveys, steps in survey research, formulation of research problem, operationalization of concepts, instruments of survey research, and data matrix. It may be said that survey technique is one of the significant contributions of modern science, because survey research helps social scientists to understand many social phenomena without any bias or without any subjective and value-based judgments. Modern science privileges empirical, objective understanding of social reality, but social reality is less amenable to objective understanding. Further, the researcher, being a part of the social reality, which is the object of study, faces the challenge of overcoming the subjective interpretation of reality. That is, the researcher himself or herself, being part of the society, somewhere becomes subjective in understanding his or her own social reality. For a long time, the challenge before social researchers as well as philosophers of knowledge was to how to represent the social reality objectively. Let us look at the epistemological basis of survey research. Scientific research aims to arrive at explanations which are supported by empirical evidence. Its claims are open for scientific scrutiny. Thus, the important goal of the social scientists has been to offer scientific explanations which are verifiable. Separation of facts from speculation has been the prime motive of modern science. Speculative and value-based explanations are not considered as scientific. Thus, the epistemological basis of survey research is empiricist, positivist approach. We can see that a shift from teleological explanations to causal explanations has been the hallmark of modern science. In social sciences, causal explanations have significance beyond the academic interest of the scholars, because causal explanations offered by social scientists often are used by state and various governments to formulate new policies for the welfare of the people, particularly the poor. And we can see a number of contributions of modern science, particularly in the field of social sciences, in this regard. And the most appropriate technique of data collection in the direction of arriving at causal explanations is survey research. The methodological importance of numbers. Survey research generates factual data. It aims at generating data which is based on facts. It is not based on speculation. Thus, we can say that the data collected by the survey researcher is empirically valid and factual data. And most of this data in survey research is in the form of numbers. Of course, there are exceptions wherein social scientists and survey researchers also use textual data, but numbers are more prominently used in survey research, and thus survey research is often called as quantitative research. But we should know the reasons for using numbers. Why numbers? It is for the simple reason that numbers are value free and value neutral when compared to the textual data. Numbers can be interpreted objectively and universally. Numbers can help in arriving at causal laws. Numbers in aggregate speak for themselves and offer the scope for valid interpretations. Thus, it may be said that survey technique is closely linked to numbers. The other important reason for the association is that survey technique is used to collect data from a large number of respondents. Unlike qualitative or interpretative research techniques, in survey technique, data is collected from a large number of respondents. So, collation of responses from a large number of respondents in the form of numbers facilitates quick analysis of data, arriving at aggregate data which are used for further statistical analysis. Let us look at the definition and meaning of survey research. Survey is a technique used in modern science quite widely. It is used across all disciplines, more popularly used with relation to understanding social phenomena. We will take two definitions here and then we move on to the meaning of survey research. Social survey is an investigation of the structures and processes of a community within well-defined geographical boundaries, given by Mark Abraham. Then another definition, social survey is the scientific study of its conditions and needs for the purpose of presenting a constructive program of social advance as a method of social introspection checked by statistical measurement and the comparative standards for the social expert. This was given by E.W. Burgess, and within these two definitions we can find certain important features of survey research, which when put together reads like this. Survey is a fact-finding study in which information is collected in a standardized and methodical manner from people against a set of questions or statements meant to measure the concepts under investigation, and aggregate data is presented. So what are the key important features of survey research? Some of the important features of survey research are: survey is a fact-finding study from a population or a sample drawn from the population at a particular point of time in a definite geographical area. Data collected in a natural setting, seeks responses from respondents directly, uses the standardized questionnaire or interview schedule, covers a large number of population. Survey is a fact-finding study in which data are collected from a sample drawn from the population, and if the data are collected from a sample, it is called a sample survey, and if the data are collected from all members of the population, then it is called a census survey. So most of the social surveys are sample surveys. That's why we often hear the term sample surveys. And social survey is conducted at a particular point of time. So there is a definite time frame. If it is a longitudinal study, data are collected over a period of time in one or two or more than time periods. And social survey always confines to a particular geographical area, and data are collected in a natural setting. That means researchers go to the field and collect data first hand from the respondents. So researchers seek responses from respondents directly, and they use a standardized questionnaire or an interview schedule to collect data. And as I have mentioned before, survey research covers a large number of population. In other words, survey research is a technique of gathering information by questioning those individuals who are the object of the research belonging to a representative sample through a standardized questioning procedure with the aim of studying the relationship among variables. Purposes of survey research. Survey research is conducted to provide information, to describe a social phenomenon, to explain a social phenomenon, that means to explain the reasons or causes for the occurrence of a social phenomenon, to make comparisons of demographic groups, to analyze the cause-effect relationship to make predictions. Advantages of survey research. Survey research covers a wide range of issues. Generalizations are possible through the outcomes of survey research. Survey research offers flexibility, and the findings or outcomes of the survey research are verifiable because data can always be checked, and The survey research offers advantage of time and expenditure when compared to other methods like ethnography or other qualitative research methods. And survey research is amenable to statistical analysis. Thus, survey research is placed at a higher level when it comes to analysis and prediction. Limitations of survey research. The most important limitation in the survey research is the willingness of the respondents. The respondents should be willing to provide the information wholeheartedly for the questionnaire or the interview schedule developed by the researcher. Then it is also prone to sampling errors. As I have just now mentioned, most of the surveys are sample surveys in which sample is drawn, and in some cases the sample drawn may not be the representative sample. Thus, it is prone to errors arising out of selecting the particular sample. Of course, there are also measurement errors which are more to do with the instrument developed by the researcher, that is questionnaire or the interview schedule. And survey research is not suitable to understand complex social issues. For example, secularism, right, or empowerment. Then there are also issues related to validity and reliability of the instruments used by the researcher. Then if we quickly look at the history of surveys, during the late 19th century and early 20th century, the researchers, who are basically individuals who had the enthusiasm to understand the society of that time, were deeply influenced by the rapid growth of urban population, declining standards of living, large-scale migration, increasing crime rate, unemployment, etc. As a result of industrial revolution in the West, particularly in the United Kingdom and more particularly in cities like London. The early surveys were poverty studies. Charles Booth was interested to know about living conditions of poor in London. His work was published as Labour and Life of the People of London. He was disturbed by poverty and living conditions of the working class families in London, because at that time London was witnessing huge unprecedented growth because of large scale immigration from countryside to work. People were coming to work in the industry setup as part of industrial revolution. He commenced a survey in 1886 and published the results in 1902. So we can consider this as the first survey in the history of survey research. Then Roundtree published the work Poverty, a study of town life in 1902. He collected data on housing, occupation, earnings of every wage earning family in York City in the UK. A.L. Bowley is known for introducing sample survey. He conducted a 5-town survey in 1912 in the UK, published his work Livelihood and Poverty in 1915. Roundtree again conducted a survey in 1935 in the UK and published Poverty and Progress in 1941. He attempted to analyze the causes of poverty. Thus, we can say that the early studies or early surveys were basically poverty studies. Later on, it extended to other fields, and significant surveys were conducted in the early 20th century, and further on were basically like town planning surveys, opinion polls, consumer surveys, market research surveys, and there are several fields survey research extended. Steps in survey research. Broadly, we can put these steps like formulation of research problem, data collection, data analysis, and results. So these are the 4 broad steps one can arrive at when discussing about survey research. Let us look at the first step, that is formulation of a research problem, because this is the most important step in any survey research. Formulation of a research problem. Formulation of a research problem, it's a kind of, it's a journey the researcher undertakes in which the researcher tries to transform the theoretical hypothesis into empirically observable indicators. So it's a journey from theory to observable indicators. Let us know what is this process and how researchers have defined this process or explained this process. Theory consists of interconnected propositions, and as you know, proposition is an expression of something that can be either true or false, and theory is at a higher level of abstraction and generalization. For example, higher the level of individualism in a given social group, greater is the suicide rate, is a theory offered by Durkheim. So we can see that this theoretical statement is at a higher level of abstraction, yet it is generalizable. And in this theoretical statement, we can see two important concepts used, that is individualism and suicide. But how to observe, empirically observe these two concepts used in this theory? Because these concepts are at a higher level of abstraction and they are not readily empirically observable. For example, if you look at individualism, it means lack of social cohesion, social control, lack of belongingness, and less integration. Durkheim's theory became universally valid because of its generalizability. This theory is applicable across societies and across cultures. It can also be applied in the Indian context, where we are witnessing a large number of farmer suicides today. After theory, we move on to hypothesis. A hypothesis is a provisional or tentative statement implying relationship between two or more variables. So when compared to theory, hypothesis is at a lower level of abstraction, less general, and close to empirical reality because it is more specific. It is more amenable for empirical testing. For example, from the theory of suicide or Durkheim's theory on suicide, we can arrive at two hypotheses like suicides are less among married people. Then another hypothesis could be married people are more or well integrated. Then another hypothesis which we can draw, not related to theory of suicide but in general, is that poor are more alienated from the political process. So these are some of the hypotheses, hypothetical statements. So survey researcher has to transform the theory into testable hypothesis or hypothesis. So the researcher can arrive at one, two or more hypotheses depending on the research interest. Are hypotheses themselves observable? That means by arriving at a hypothesis, is it sufficient or is it sufficient to go for data collection? No. We have to understand hypothesis at a more intensive manner. A hypothesis states the relationship between two or more concepts. Let us look at what are concepts. What are these concepts? The meaning of the concept is that it is a semantic content of linguistic science and mental images. Concepts are the building blocks of theory, and concepts are the means to establish connection between theory and the empirical world. For example, integration, alienation, these are the concepts used by the researcher to test a theory or build a theory. Concepts are rooted in empirical world and concepts are the observable entities. So a network of concepts form a theory, and the important step in the survey research is operationalization of concepts. The steps in this process, the steps in the operationalization of concepts are application of concepts to concrete objects. That means concepts are applied to the properties of objects. Here objects refer to the respondents or the units of analysis. Each concept should be measurable in terms of property of the object. Here the researcher attempts to measure the property of the object, that means the respondents' attitudes, for example the respondents' attitudes or opinions or perceptions, etc. You can look at the examples here. Class is measured among individual respondents. Alienation, participation in the political process. Integration is measured through, one of the measurements is through marital status and number of children. Thus each concept is measured through certain indicators which are found in the objects of research, that is the respondents. Then the next step is offering the operational definition. So there are formal definitions and operational definitions. Operational definitions are offered by the researcher according to the research project aims or objectives and also the research setting or the research situation. So formal definitions are offered by early researchers, and the literature of review of literature suggests these formal definitions. But the researcher can offer the operational definition for the purpose of the survey he or she is conducting. And this operational definition allows the researcher to observe or make specific observations in the field. For example, the definition of family. The formal definition of family is something, and whereas when it comes to operational definition, it may change depending on the culture or society in which the research is carried out. So thus the researcher can offer an operational definition based on the requirement. The properties of objects are measured in terms of categories called variables, and variable is a measurable form. So in the third step, the properties of objects are measured in terms of categories called variables. What are these? Let us look at the kind of relationship between concept, property and a variable. If you take the example of science, that is area as a concept, and the property which you are measuring is room, and the variable is indicated in terms of size, that is 145 square feet. And if you take the concept of age and you are measuring the property of an object or the respondent, that is individual, here the variable is measured in terms of years, that is 22 years as presented in the slide. Then if you take the concept of class, you are measuring this property in an individual respondent, and the variable corresponding to this is annual income, that is rupees 2,10,000 as given in the slide. So you have concepts and the property where you are measuring, or property of the object the researcher is measuring and explaining or measuring in terms of particular variables. Variables are measured at 4 levels, and these 4 levels of measurement are nominal, ordinal, interval and ratio level of measurement. Certain concepts are simple, for example gender, whereas social researchers come across concepts which are highly complex. For example, empowerment, participation, secularism, etc. are the complex variables and complex concepts which have to be measured on multiple dimensions. The simple concepts can be measured on single dimension, whereas complex concepts have to be measured on more than two dimensions. So if you look at the slide, the concept empowerment is measured at three dimensions, that is political, social and economic. So within social, you can see the different indicators, that is decision making in the family, education and employment. These are the indicators for the social dimension of empowerment. So the concept of empowerment is mentioned on a multiple multiple dimensions, and thus a concept is transformed into empirically observed indicators. So the researcher's task here is to arrive at the indicators which can help the researcher to understand the extent of the property in the individual with relation to that particular concept. For example, if you take women empowerment, how do we measure using these dimensions? And along these three dimensions, we have to have sub-dimensions in this, and these form the empirical indicators. So this is done by social scientists across for several concepts. And coming to the units of analysis, the unit of analysis could range from individual to nation. Unit of analysis is the one from whom the data are collected. It could be an individual, it could be household, it could be village, it could be an organization, it could be a group like self-help groups, or it could be a state, or it could be nation. For example, Human Development Index. Nations are considered to arrive at that index, or census survey is based on the households, right? So there are several units, and the unit is decided by the researcher depending on the research question he or she is pursuing. Coming to another important aspect of survey research, that is the instruments of survey research. The instruments used in the survey research are questionnaire and interview schedule. A questionnaire consists of a set of questions or statements. For that matter, interview schedule also is similar to questionnaire, but it is different from questionnaire because interview schedule is the one which is filled by the interviewer by asking the respondents questions or by seeking the responses from the respondent directly, whereas a questionnaire is the one which is filled by the respondents on their own. So thus, questionnaire or interview schedule consists of a set of questions or statements, and each question is aimed at measuring the property, that is getting the response from the respondent. And every question has a purpose and is measured at any of the four levels. Just mentioned before. And each question should stimulate the respondent to answer. Thus, we can say that survey instrument is all about stimuli responses. The other important point about survey research is standardization of the questions used in the questionnaire. That the reason is every question should evoke similar understanding across all the respondents. That means to say that the question posed should give same sense of meaning to all the respondents. Why it is necessary? Because survey research is all about arriving at aggregate value. To make the responses of different respondents comparable, every question thus to make the responses of different respondents comparable, every question thus should evoke same meaning. This allows for comparing across a large number of respondents. For example, a question like what is your income should give same meaning to all the respondents. It should not be that some respondents assume it to be a question on annual income and some others would take it as monthly income. So thus the question should be rephrased as what is your annual income or what is your monthly income. Then take another example. How many persons are there in your family? So here some respondents would consider a family as the one which consists of grandparents and parents and their siblings apart from other members of the extended family. Whereas some other respondents might consider it to be simply their parents and their siblings. So thus the meaning family is arrived at differently by the different respondents. So instead the researcher should frame the question more appropriately according to the cultural and social aspects of that research setting. Then the next two steps in the survey research process are data collection and data analysis. Of course, you will learn about these two aspects in detail in the later modules. But let me conclude this module by discussing very briefly about the data sheet. How does a data sheet look like? It is called as tripartite form of data. It is nothing but the relationship between objects, stimuli and responses. It is mentioned as O, S and R. O stands for objects, that is respondents. S stands for stimuli, that is questions, and responses. So if you transfer the data into data sheet, it should look like this. The data matrix is nothing but the relationship between objects, stimuli and responses. The data matrix has S1, S2, S3, Sn columns. These are the stimuli, that is variables, whereas rows consist of O1, O2, O3 and On. These refer to the objects or the respondents, and the cells consist of R, R11, R12, R13 and so on. So they refer to the responses of the respondents to each of these questions or stimuli. So when the data is entered, data sheet look like this. The researcher should look for the empty cells in the data sheet and also for random errors and systematic errors. Then data will be ready for further analysis. So this is in brief about survey research. The most important thing for you to understand is the process of transforming theoretical entities into empirically observable indicators. So this is a complex and intensive process. It is a tough journey for any social researcher, and it demands considerable attention from the researcher. Survey research demands considerable attention, or survey research demands considerable academic interest from the researcher, as this process forms key for the entire survey research process. Thank you.